I was asked to go through guidelines and comment on them. I've done so at least partly. But as a starting point, around 15 years ago, I went through study protocols for oncology studies conducted in Sweden. The reason was that I noticed that the median age was around 10 years lower than in the target population, actually. It was not in the protocol. It was the clinician who decided who to enroll. That was really clear to me, and it's 15 years ago. The clinician as the gatekeeper for clinical studies, I believe, is becoming more and more important. Today, less than 5% of oncology patients are enrolled in clinical studies. And it appears, at least in Sweden, that this percentage is going down. We also know from a survey that investigators tend to ask for participation in around 20% of the patients formally fulfilling eligibility criteria. So there is a very important selection bias also before asking the questions. And remember, patients that according to the protocol were eligible. To show that I'm not only focused on cancer, why not heart failure? It's also a disease of the elderly. So what has been done here? It's an interesting work in the sense that it has focused on eligibility criteria. And here you can see that around 25% of the protocol had an upper age limit. On the other hand, you could say 75% did not have. And the authors, they summarize what they can see as not fully justified exclusion criteria as around 45%. And that, of course, is a rather high percentage. To me, an interesting part was to notice that in trials with medicinal products in the European Union, an upper age limit was there in 16 out of 33 trials, while in the US, 3 out of 37. However, I really don't know whether these criteria in any way were reflected in differences in median age. So is it the protocol, or is it the investigator, the clinician? My bias is towards the clinician, of course, as you have noticed. No to guidance documents. Cardiac failure, it's around 12 years old now, and it was not discussed in that guidance document. We have heard about the general documents. Now at EMA, there is a so-called guidance consistency group. And guidance documents has a tendency to become larger and larger, incorporating elements from statistical guidelines and other guidelines and so on. And therefore, this consistency group tend to say that, no, this is nothing unique for this therapeutic area. Refer instead to the pharmacokinetic guideline or the biomarker guideline or the statistical guideline. I guess they would not do that for heart failure and elderly, but let's see how it was handled. Okay, we have gone through this document, or Christina had done it. What I just wanted to emphasize here is frail patients randomly distributed. I'll come back to that, and it will partly touch on some of the issues we have discussed during or after Christina's presentation. Now, what's in the anti-cancer note for guidance? I would say, as I'm partly responsible for the wording, I would say it's nothing. It's saying something about enrolled patients, representative, and so on. But there is little of guidance here. There is something. It opens for alternative endpoints, and that's good, but there is no guidance. So if I wanted anything from guidelines, it would be that it does not repeat what's everywhere, that is, should be representative and so on. But if there are something specific to consider when it comes to drug development for the elderly, such as other endpoint, and we could come up with concrete advice, that would be good. But otherwise, we can leave it to the overarching documents. Personal view, of course. So what does it look like? It's a relatively old overview, 10 years old now. But I don't think that there has been a major change. And if anything, in the so-called wrong direction. I will come back to that later on. But you see that if those 65 years and older, those represent 60% of the total population with cancer. 35% went into the clinical trial. I would say not too bad. And even 75 years old, just it seems like 10% and 30%. A third of the target population go into clinical trials. I mean, the percentage in the clinical trial, I said that overall there are 5%. But in clinical trials, 10% were 75 years and older, and in the target population, 30%. Not too bad. But you notice that these trials were conducted over a specific period of time. And to the left, you see breast cancer. A very, very similar representation in clinical trials as in the community. And that refers to aromatase inhibitors, that is some sort of hormonal therapy thought to be less aggressive, more suitable for the treatment of elderly. That's why I believe, and this is a large target population, and there were many competitors out there. So that's the reason why I believe that the situation is a bit worse today than in this overview from the US. Another thing, and in the middle you see lung cancer. There 70 or close to 70% of the target population with lung cancer are 65 years old and older, and around 35% of those in clinical trials. That's one way of looking at it. And if you instead take the characteristics of patients actually treated with chemotherapy, the difference becomes a bit smaller. You see that in the age group of 65 to 74, 62% were treated with chemotherapy, to be compared with those 35. Again, not such a major deviation, but certainly there is missing data here. Coming back to my favorite theme then, the clinician as the gatekeeper. Well, you can see what's on the screen, but the basic idea was, Medical Research Council conducted a large trial with relatively familiar compound drugs, nothing new from that perspective, in a community setting, with very permissive inclusion criteria. And they still ended up with a trial where the median age was around 10 years lower than in the representative population. And wisely, investigators were asked, why is it so? And it turned out that in parallel to the 420 or so patients enrolled in the clinical trial, there were more than 700 patients treated with chemotherapy off trial. And again, this was not, the Focus Fund trial was not a trial with very innovative drugs, well-known drugs. Now coming back to Andre's question, and I tend to agree to you. Prior to the first registration trial, we have very limited information, to be honest, about PK, safety, tolerability, toxicity, what happens in comorbidity. So whatever is in the protocol, the responsible physician will try to avoid elderly patients that are likely to be more sensitive to changes in kidney function, liver function, hidden comorbidities, whatever. So that is I believe, a sensible view of looking at drug development. Do not enroll too early in confirmatory trials. And you know, speed is everything today. So today we have very limited information about the safety prior to confirmatory trials. You might like it or not, but that's a fact. But later on, yeah, what's the problem? Partly touched upon the risk to the patient. But if you compare what happened in the first trials with irinotecan, it's a cytotoxic compound, the frequency of febrile neutropenia and death was horrible. But physicians learned to handle that. So learning based on relatively healthy patients. So start there. There is also a risk to the trial, diluting the treatment effect. That's a fact, as far as we know at least. We believe so. So what can we do? We can try to reduce the risk. And for the patient, if we have a more solid database, they can be enrolled. That should be fine. And for the trial, what can be done there? And my proposal here is that you could try to conduct in parallel, or not in parallel, a study with a primary efficacy and safety population, aiming at recruiting, enrolling patients that would normally go into clinical trial, and then a secondary safety and efficacy population of those patients that would be treated in clinical practice. How to handle this based on inclusion, exclusion criteria, etc. Of course, I don't have the solution, but it should be possible. I have just put dose escalation in bold here. I have never understood why it is so hard to convince treating clinicians that they should dose escalate if the drug, we are talking about drugs, cytotoxic compounds or other compounds where dose is based on maximum tolerated dose. If it is too well tolerated, the exposure is too low. It has been very hard to convince physicians in normal clinical trials. I guess it will be even more problematic in this sort of trials, but I guess we have to live with it. In the Focus 2 trial, there were 14% of the patients had a dose escalation, and I'm very convinced that it should have been a higher percentage, but the investigators were happy with that. Okay. Again, personal view. Studies to be conducted specifically in the frail and elderly, and it has been done with Norelbin, and I guess that's 20 years ago or something. I refer to this Focus 2 trial. It's a medical research council trial. We have seen some advices around acute myeloid leukemia and elderly, partly because patients with AML at a high age has I would say, a clearly different disease from those below 50 years or something. So is there a need for some sort of specific incentives for companies, drug developers, doing something for these specific patient population? I don't know, but at least it might be worthwhile thinking around. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Bertil. Eric had to step out for a few minutes, so I'm Thomas Salmonsson. I'm co-chairing this one with Eric. and I jump in a little bit earlier than we initially intended that I should. So, any questions for Bertil before Eva?
Yes, so this is Eva Bredberg again from AstraZeneca.
Could you please?
So my question, Bertil, and I think it's also to Christina as well. You say, why not make a specifically designed study to include the frail patients? But how do we define the frail patients? That's my concern.
From my perspective, I guess it's condition specific. If you were talking about, say, lung cancer, I guess that performance status 2 and impaired lung function to a certain degree, to me, would be sufficiently convincing that you're talking about a frail patient. For other therapeutic areas, chronic bronchitis, it's not that easy to define what would be, but perhaps loss in muscle function, clearly severe impaired lung function, something a composite of different aspects of the disease, especially loss of muscle function, I believe, is in a way cardinal for advanced chronic bronchitis. So there are, and as always, we cannot, if we are going to come up with a perfect definition, it's meaningless because it will never be applicable and it will take too long. So better to come up with something that is worthwhile to discuss around and then see what we can do.
And we do have quite a few talks on this topic tomorrow, Bertil.
Yes.
To get you off the hook as well. Yeah. So if Eva can wait, we'll come back to that.
I will, yeah.
I do see a colleague, ex-colleague of mine. Is it Marko Toivonen in the back?
But Thomas, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm Marko Toivonen, NTA Advisory Services. Just a very simple.
Hey, Marko, please.
I will try to speak up. Yes, very simple question. In keeping in mind your idea of investigator as the gatekeeper, in the context of scientific advice, have you advised sponsors to perhaps place a cap on the number of younger patients in clinical trials when it's obvious that there will be specific needs in the elderly population?
I guess I didn't hear the full question, but I heard something about investigators and variability.
On the number of younger patients.
A cap of the number of
yeah. But may I start with the way I wanted to interpret your question, and that is to say that apparently investigators are possible to educate. I mean, there are studies showing that after priming or whatever you call it, they enroll many more patients out of the potential group of patients. They are more successful in discussing with the patient about pros and cons of enrolling in clinical trial. So, I mean, for studies in patients with depression, it's almost obligatory to have some sort of scale rating exercises. But also, in order to prepare investigators better to enroll, I guess it would be an issue. This issue about...
you have to hurry up a bit.
About capping for younger patients. Well, it partly, in general, I guess you could be said to be right. But I have this problem about the need for more knowledge in order to enroll elderly, more frail patients. But capping is always perhaps a good solution.